Well, good morning and welcome to our last unit together, Systems of Belief and Ideas of Order. So, if you think about it, this semester we've looked at the individual and his relationship to society. We have examined how writers present and depict individuals' relationship and connection with the environment and nature. And so, for this last unit, what we're doing is we're looking at how individuals adhere to or construct systems of belief or adhere to ideas of order. In other words, how do we construct and why are we drawn to certain frameworks for understanding human experience? I'm excited because in this last unit, we're going to look at a play by Susan Glaspell. We're also going to be looking at poets and some fiction to see how they present characters and circumstances where these systems of belief or these ideas of order uh, are are described, are tested, um, and what happens when they collapse, right? When conflict comes and the framework through which, or the lens through which we've viewed and assigned meaning to our existence gets tested and gets strained. Makes for some very interesting reading and meditations. We wonder about where we get these systems of belief or how we construct these ideas of order. Certainly, do we get them at church? Do we get them at Walmart? Do we get them on the television, iTunes? Of course, I'm being facetious here, but we should probably begin or depart with this idea of how it is that these systems of belief um, are transmitted to the individual. Well, let's begin considering this first question. Why are systems of belief important to human beings? Well, systems of belief historically provide us frameworks for understanding the purpose of our lives, trying to find out the meaning of life, right? The proverbial question, why am I here? They can help us understand our relationship to the physical world and the laws that seem to govern it. A system of belief can be used for guiding our thoughts, our words, and our actions. And is it possible not to have one? In the instance of anarchy, or sometimes the philosophical uh, school of thought known as existentialism or nihilism. So it leads me to the observation that maybe not having a system of belief actually is one, right? I can remember talking to my son Jack when he was a young boy, like 5 or 6, and I asked him what he wanted to be when he grew up, and he said, "I don't want to be anything." And of course, I laughed at his naivete, and I was trying to reason him through it. And I said, "Well, son, you got to be something, right? You can't just be nothing." And he looked at me and he said, "Well, isn't nothing something?" And it was at that point I knew I was in real deep trouble with that kid. I'm sure that already by now you have your mind has already raced to the system of belief or the idea of order that religion offers human beings, right? It's probably the very first system of belief that came to your mind. The various world religions, Judaism, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, etc. Each major religion, as you know, has a system for understanding basic concepts associated with the human condition and the human existence, such as creation. How did all of this come to be? Life and the way we should conduct our lives, our attitudes toward death, the idea of the soul and what happens after we die, right? Deliberations and meditations on salvation, etc. Add to this the myriad of denominations and other schisms, and there is no shortage at all of guidelines that religion offers human beings. Science as well provides a system whereby we may better understand the physical, natural world. The whole concept of taxonomy, right? How we understand flora and fauna by virtue of genus and species, right? This provides a framework, doesn't it? It orders and patterns our understanding how we classify and categorize the world through which we move and with which we interact. So science obviously uh, provides us an idea of ordering. Morality and ethics. Generally speaking, when we speak of the terms morality and ethics, we are examining how we determine what is good, what is bad, and moral duty and obligations. Obviously, philosophies along with world religions abound. I encourage you each to take an introduction to philosophy course, if you have not already done so, and you can understand and become familiar with various philosophic systems of belief, asceticism, utilitarianism, etc. Obviously, carpe diem, right? And I know many of you have watched and studied Dead Poets Society, the philosophy of carpe diem, right, which is to seize the day. That's a system of belief, right? It says make the most of every day that you have, to live life abundantly, seeking out its pleasures. Of course, a few years ago there was the YOLO hashtag, right? You only live once, which was basically just an ignorant and uneducated way of expressing the Latin phrase carpe diem. It's not just religion and philosophy. Politics, if you think about it um, on a very large macro scale, right? We are political beings, and the way that we organize ourselves, the terms under which we agree to live, these are all fascinating courses of study and provide order for our daily lives. If we think about, broadly speaking, concepts such as democracies, dictatorships, totalitarian states, communism, socialism, etc., right? Don't each of these present a certain way of suggesting how best for human beings to be governed, what a system of belief politically will allow individuals to reach their highest potential, both individually and for the greater good. a discussion of systems of belief and ideas of order may include considering aesthetics. The term aesthetics deals with the nature of beauty, the nature of art, and taste with the creation and appreciation of beauty. As we've seen, artists and writers are usually quite interested in aesthetics. What makes a beautiful poem? What makes a story effective? So artists are aware of a particular tradition in which they are working, a form from which they work, and they may resist, innovate, or adhere to certain aesthetic standards. And I think we could probably just consider briefly artists like Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. They were very, very familiar with the traditional aesthetic of poetry, the conventions of rhyme and meter. And they chose deliberately, didn't they, to react against a certain aesthetic. And in doing so, through their innovations, created, right, their own unique style of poetry. Aesthetics can inform the way we judge and evaluate art. If we think about terms such as realism, imagism, expressionism, impressionism, modernism, all of these isms are essentially aesthetic periods, aesthetic um, eras, right, where certain aesthetic choices came into fashion and became prominent on a large scale. Right now, for example, my wife is obsessed with mid-century modernists, right? And that architectural style. She is very drawn to that, to the choices that mid-century modern uh, provide. Those long, sleek lines, very clean. Of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with the way we live our lives in our home, but she's very drawn to that. She's attracted to that. So as we read the selections in this unit, what we want to be sort of on the lookout for are these various systems of belief or these ideas of order. We want to try to identify what system of belief seems to be in play. In other words, what ideology seems to be presented or, more interestingly, challenged and or resisted. And how and where do we see the author expressing his or her support or resistance of the belief system? Think briefly of Norman MacLean and A River Runs Through It, right? We certainly see some contrasting systems of belief as they are presented in the various casting methods, don't we, between the father, uh, the Reverend MacLean, and his two sons, Norman and Paul. And not only is there an aesthetic that is presented in MacLean's novel, you also see, too, the concept of order and a certain code. Let's think about that MacLean code. There was a way that those boys and within that family, the way they were raised, the things that they valued, how they valued the family, love, the river, and how communion within and among those endeavors, right, was a way that that family showed its love and showed its deep affinity with the divine. You remember, you're never late for work, fishing, and church. We can consider a couple pieces, short pieces that we've already read. And you can see, in addition to A River Runs Through It, how these short poems also present a speaker uh, sorting through some type of system belief or idea of order. Think about Whitman's poem that we've read and talked about this semester. When I heard the learned astronomer, it provides a great example of contrasting systems of belief, doesn't it? If we think about the tension and the conflict that we detect in the speaker and how he differs significantly from those assembled in the lecture room. And so the system of belief that's being challenged, what precisely is it, right? And I think when we discuss that poem, it's about contrasting systems of belief of knowledge, right? Which how does the individual truly know something, right? How do we learn things? Does knowledge and learning come from an external source, or does it come from an individual's immediate and intuitive experience and interaction um, with the world? And in that poem, it seems, doesn't it, that Whitman is trying to get us to see that the more meaningful way of knowing is through the individual, right? Uh, um, I think we also studied Dickinson's short poem 324. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home with a bobolink for a chorister and an orchard for a dome. Remember that one? And the speaker at the end says, so instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along, right? This is a great poem, right? To see how the speaker is challenging a system of belief, the whole system of how does one observe the Sabbath? How does one worship? And the poem sets up a very nice and very easy to detect opposition between corporate worship in a traditional way versus an individual's ability to celebrate the Sabbath by herself, um, isolated but in connection with the natural world, as opposed to the traditional orthodoxy and dogma of organized religion, which is very man-made, isn't it, with all the human artifacts that go along with corporate worship and traditional um, religious gatherings. And if we think about the last two lines of that poem, if you have it in front of you, if you don't, you should look at it, poem 324, and look at those last two lines of the poem, because the last two lines of the poem show us how the speaker seems to resolve this tension between these two traditional these two systems of belief, right? When she says, so instead of getting to heaven at last, I'm going all along, right? In the second to the last line, or the penultimate line, the speaker says that in the traditional way of worshiping or with organized religion, heaven is something that is deferred, right? It comes after life. And by contrast, what she's saying is that I don't have to wait, I don't have to defer heaven. I'm going all along, right? It's not, heaven's not some place she's getting to. Heaven is something that she is able to experience each day, right? Through her own unique way of observing the Sabbath, right? That Dickinson, man, she could do it. So anyway, I was going to draw this little presentation to a close. Some ideas to think about. Again, systems of belief, ideas of order. We want to be on the lookout for what type of system of belief or idea of order seems to be being treated in the poem, in the play, and in the story. It really does make for some fine reading, because there's always conflict in these pieces. And again, conflict is always important in literature because conflict is that thing. It's that element in whatever it is, a poem, a story, or a play. Conflict is the thing that creates suspense. Okay, so if you don't have conflict, you don't have suspense. And you got to have suspense because suspense is what keeps us going. It keeps us reading. It keeps us engaged and alert and wanting to find out, how does this thing resolve itself? How is this thing going to turn out? All right. I miss you guys. Hope to see you soon.